And the title of this hearing is the U.S. Mexico Relationship, Advancing Security and Prosperity on Both Sides of the Border. We're going to have one panel testify today. It'll feature the Honorable Roger Noriega, Ambassador and Visiting Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and the Honorable Bill Richardson, former Governor of New Mexico, among other important positions that he's held. And of course, both have impressive careers in this field, and we are fortunate and grateful to them for being with us today. We look forward to your testimony. Today we'll discuss a topic that I believe is both timely and important, and that is how we can continue to advance the deep economic, security, and people-to-people ties between the United States and Mexico that have proven to be vital for the well-being of both of our respective nations. I recently joined my colleagues in introducing a bipartisan resolution to reaffirm the importance of bilateral cooperation that advances our nation's national security and economic interests and underlines the strategic partnership between the United States and Mexico. And I urge all of my colleagues to join us in supporting this bipartisan resolution. Earlier this week, I welcomed Mexican Ambassador Gutierrez to his new post in Washington, D.C. He's been on the job now for about 3 weeks, and I extended my sincere and strong desire to work together on the challenges and on the opportunities we both share for our respective countries. To this end, it is my hope that to address common challenges, including counterterrorism and counter-narcotics, we can advance security cooperation between the United States and the Mexican militaries, law enforcement, and intelligence communities. Improving security also requires a judicial system that investigates and prosecutes crimes. As indicated in the State Department's 2016 International Narcotics Control Strategy Report, Mexico remains a major transit point for illegal drugs destined for the United States, as well as an originator for both heroin, marijuana, and methamphetamine. And I note that, by the way, not as a negative slight against Mexico, because on the other side of that equation is the transit point is to the United States, and it's our consumption problem that is an equal part of that problem. We should also note that the Mexican government has increased its public and national security budget to more than $15.4 billion with an aim to combat and prevent organized crime. Under the Merida Initiative Partnership, Congress provided nearly $1.5 billion from fiscal year 2008 to 2016. This assistance also addresses human rights, the rule of law, and public security. However, drug trafficking and related violence in Mexico continues to pose a significant problem to Mexico's security and to its economic development. The DEA notes that Mexican criminal networks transport the bulk of their goods over the southwest border through ports of entry using passenger vehicles or tractor trailers. In passenger vehicles, the drugs may be held in secret compartments, while in tractor trailers, the drugs are often commingled with other legitimate goods. Less commonly used methods to move drugs include smuggling them through cross-border underground tunnels and on commercial cargo trains, small boats, and ultralight aircraft. Mexico is also experiencing an alarming surge in poppy cultivation and heroin production. According to the U.S. Office of National Drug Control Policy, 28,000 hectares of opium poppy were cultivated in Mexico in 2015. That was up from 17,000 in 2014, a 64.7% increase. Virtually all of Mexico-sourced heroin is consumed in the United States, and Mexico is reportedly the source of more than 90% of the heroin seized in the United States. That's up 50% from 2012. Additionally, new synthetic opioids like fentanyl that are substantially more powerful and deadlier than heroin are increasingly being produced and trafficked into the United States through Mexico using precursor chemicals from China. We are all, I think, committed to supporting the work of law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border to counter the increase in cross-border trafficking of heroin and fentanyl and to fight transnational criminal organizations. But this must be done with the support and the attention of both nations. Senator Markey and I have introduced the Interdict Act, which would provide U.S. Customs and Border Protection with better tools to detect and stop fentanyl coming into the country. As neighbors, we need to tackle security challenges together. Our nations share a border of nearly 2,000 miles, but we also share a long history of cooperation and a mutual desire to see peace and prosperity through Central and South America. Both countries have worked jointly to further advance and protect democracy, as well as to support democratic institutions in other parts of the Western Hemisphere, as best evidenced by yesterday's vote at the OAS, in which Mexico stood strongly on behalf of freedom and democracy in the region. We cannot talk, of course, about our relationship with Mexico without mentioning the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and our deep economic ties across the border. According to the U.S. Trade Representative, the U.S. exports to Mexico and Canada are responsible for more than 3 million American jobs, and both countries purchase more American goods and services than any country in the world. However, according to information published by the Census Bureau, the trade deficit with Mexico went from a surplus to a deficit, and it's continued to grow since NAFTA went into effect. The current administration has signaled its intention to modernize this agreement. We need to ensure that our trade with Mexico is free but also fair. For example, Florida's agricultural community, some segments of it, have been harmed in the past by Mexico's ability to supply the U.S. market with produce in large quantities and at prices that are often below production costs. This is particularly true for our tomato growers and our strawberry growers. This past weekend, I was in the Tampa Bay area. I visited the Florida strawberry fields, and I heard about the challenges our farmers have faced from unfair competition. These are issues that Secretary Ross and our trade representative will have to address as changes are considered. If done correctly, I think the efforts to modernize NAFTA can produce significant economic and strategic benefits for all three countries. In addition to these challenges, we also have the issue of immigration and of border security. While the rhetoric on the subject is sometimes heated, both of our nations have a responsibility and an interest in stemming the flow of illicit activity crossing the U.S. Mexico border. We often think of this issue in terms of America's southern border. We also need to be cognizant of the pressure Mexico faces along its own southern border due to migration from Central America and through Central America. For our two nations, this isn't simply a question of how we can improve our border security. We need to think and act strategically to advance policies that advance democracy, security, and economic prosperity throughout the entire hemisphere. Because when people feel confident in the future in their home countries, they don't have to migrate to the United States illegally, at least not at the levels we've seen throughout the decades. We need to work with our Mexican partners to enhance their ability to police and defend their own southern border, which is an entry point for many migrants who seek to transit through Mexico, more often than not on their way to the United States. As I stated earlier, the U.S. and Mexico have a long history of cooperation. As Senators Cornyn, Flake, Udall, and others representing border states will tell you, our two countries are intertwined by history and by shared interests in the future. Our people have worked together and interacted for generations. Many Americans of Mexican descent have achieved great success in business, sports, arts, medicine, politics, just to name a few. And it is in our mutual interest to continue to work together to ensure economic opportunities and strengthen our security on both sides of the border. I look forward to hearing from both of our witnesses about this critical relationship, and with that, I turn it to the ranking member, Senator Menendez. And just as a side note, my understanding is next week there'll potentially be a working coffee with the Foreign Minister of Mexico. He was saying Mexico, so I got to work that in there too. And the second is that my understanding is that late in April, a delegation of Mexican senators will be traveling here as well. And I hope my colleagues take an opportunity to attend both of those gatherings. It's really important to establish those bonds, both with our counterparts in the Mexican Senate and also with the Foreign Minister. Thank you both for being here. Governor Richardson, thank you. Look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the subcommittee. I'm not going to enunciate the friendship I've had with those outstanding three members of the minority. And Mr. Chairman, I've always respected you and your knowledge of Latin America and your excellent Spanish, which I hope you try to match Senator Menendez. I know it's
not as good as Senator Kane's, but we're both working on it.
Mr. Chairman, this is a very important hearing.
I'll just begin with an observation, and then I'm going to start turning to the members here so they can get their questions in. Various of them have other engagements, and this is an important hearing for them. So let me say, I've heard all the facts and figures about NAFTA, but so there are winners and losers in any arrangement. So if you're a corn farmer in Iowa, NAFTA has been very good for you. If you're a dairy farmer in upstate New York, NAFTA has been very good. If you're a tomato grower or a strawberry grower in Florida, it's been more complicated and more difficult. And so that's the dynamic we have internally, and it's important to re-examine that. But here's the broader question that I have. Irrespective of whether that's a legitimate or not complaint, I think there are legitimate complaints about the way NAFTA has impacted certain sectors of our economy. That would be true on the Mexican side as well. But the Mexican people are a proud people. We talk about nationalism. There's nationalism in every country in the world, and that includes Mexico. And here's the broader observation that I have. We forget that Mexico is not just a democracy, but a vibrant one. Its leaders are elected. And if they find themselves in the crosshairs of heated rhetoric that inspires a nationalist response, leaders have to respond to that reality internally in their country. The bigger concern is the impact it has on the broader politics of Mexico and creating a space. I'm not going to mention anyone by name. I'm not here to give anyone free publicity, but imagine for a moment a candidate in Mexico who has made a career of fanning populism and nationalistic sentiments, who is also anti-NAFTA, who has attacked Mexican presidents in the past for cooperating with the United States on law enforcement and all these issues we've talked about. And imagine that person, someone like that, being able to take advantage of all of this rhetoric to be elected in that democracy. And suddenly we find ourselves with an Hugo Chavez-type leader, not in Venezuela, which is, of course, tragic, but right on our border, something we have never faced in modern history of this country. Obviously, it's up to Mexican people to decide what future they want and who they're going to vote for in the upcoming presidential race, and we shouldn't try to influence that in one way or another, other than ensure that we try to strengthen our relationship. But describe for a moment that situation internally in Mexico, what it could lead to, and what would it be like for U.S. policy? What will this hearing look like in 2 to 4 years if a leader like that assumes the presidency in Mexico, partially by capitalizing on some of the rhetoric we see here in the United States?
Well, Senator, you make an excellent point. This is why the timing on NAFTA, which is so critical, I think, to both countries. The NAFTA negotiations happen sooner or later because the Mexican state elections are in 5 months, and you want to the presidential election, as I said, I think is several months later, but it rolls into the presidential election. You want to eliminate the U.S. being a vibrant issue. You want to eliminate the statements made in the presidential race and the policies that have been initiated, and dealing with the issue of NAFTA sooner than later. This is what I would suggest. I think that one, the United States needs to move on the 90-day consultation period. Now that the health care debate is over in the Senate, in the Congress, move forward to renegotiate NAFTA sooner than later. And it does need to be modernized. First, the rules of origin. I think this is a new era. Secondly, there was no digital trade in 1993. I happened to be the Democratic whip in the House when NAFTA was being debated, and things have changed enormously. Number three, Mexico has had an opening on energy reform. Some of those energy issues, I think, need to be discussed. Issues related to manufacturing. You mentioned Venezuela, and my colleague Roger Noriega is an expert on Venezuela. The danger if there's an abrogation of NAFTA is China has invested $30 billion in Venezuela, $30 billion. And they're going to take over the vacuum if NAFTA and the United States and Canada don't reach an agreement. There's potentially a geopolitical threat too. So I think, Mr. Chairman, what you want to do is you know how important these elections are. You want to get the issues resolved in a way that they don't give impetus to any one candidate. And the U.S. Mexico relationship is right now very fragile.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I certainly agree that some of the rhetoric, the ill-informed characterizations of our relationships with Mexico, and that Mexico has taken advantage of us somehow under NAFTA, or that Mexico is forcing, literally the word, that was the word used, forcing criminal elements to come over the border and to prey on our people, has a very serious negative impact on the relationship between our two peoples. And most folks on both sides of the border understand that that's not true, and that kind of rhetoric does not really reflect the nature of our mutually respectful relationship among family members in certain ways. Certainly, when the Mexicans reflect on NAFTA, they probably have a long list of issues that they'd like to take up with us. And my guess is that those negotiations would carry on in a quiet way for 4 or 8 years, however long it takes. And in the meantime, decisions that the United States makes arbitrarily or unilaterally to go beyond the framework or the agreement of NAFTA would be a great relief to every Washington law firm that trades in trade law. And it would be tons of disputes. I don't think it's a short-run exercise. I think they can maybe lay the groundwork for these kinds of discussions, set up working groups between our two countries once we actually have people who can be on our side of the table in those discussions. But it would be a very complicated, drawn-out process. But I think it's important to note also, and I'm sure really everyone here would probably agree with this, the anxiety among the American people about lost jobs, about illegal immigration, is a genuine anxiety that's been tapped into. The problem we have to face as a country in a bipartisan, really nonpartisan way, is how do we address that anxiety for our mutual benefit? And I think there has to be an essential understanding that the global trade, you can find win-wins generally in trade agreements. And that's tough work, but it makes sense in terms of improving stability in the world, in this case, economic activity and health and prosperity on our borders. We can knit together mutually beneficial arrangements. That makes a lot of sense. So the trade agreements generally are important. But we have to find ways to address that anxiety of the American people that they haven't worked in our interests. And part of that, in the short run, is better information that tells the truth about the mutual benefits.
Thank you. And just as I'm going to turn to Senator Gardner in a second, 2 points that I think are important to raise. One is that lost in this NAFTA discussion is the emergence of the Mexican middle class. That's actually grown exponentially over the last 20 years and has been of benefit to the United States. And the second point, before I turn to Senator Gardner, is just an editorial point, is in the business world, when you want to get into a negotiation with another business, you take a maximalist position, really tough, and then you but because the lower or the higher you start, the better your ultimate outcome could potentially be. In the political world, there are consequences to taking a tough line and at the start of a negotiation, and that's what both Senator Menendez and I's questions was geared towards, is that the impact of a tough line that you think you're staking out a really good starting point, that strengthens you in a negotiation, but it has an impact on a democracy that is not applicable in the business world, where it's only about dollars and cents.
And I think, Senator, to that excellent point, I would just add on NAFTA, if we delay and not try to fix these problems sooner than later and it gets into a Mexican election, we, the United States, lose leverage by delaying. So it reinforces your point.
Noriega, you mentioned the institutions the criminal justice reform capability increase is one of the things that the Mexican government does want to work more closely with the United States on. But the other, just a good news and sort of institution, is the Mexican Navy. The Mexican Navy has been an extraordinary partner and liaison to the United States. They've proven not just capable, but willing of confronting many of the challenges that are going on. In fact, they've taken on increasing law enforcement responsibility, and there's opportunities there. No, Mexico's not destitute. They can afford to buy a lot of this equipment, but there are sales and other technologies we can make available to them on air-to-ground communications, on additional training for helicopter maintenance. That really goes a long way towards increasing the Mexican Navy capability. And that liaison relationship with the Navy of Mexico is a phenomenal relationship, and it's one of the institutions that I hope we'll continue to work closely with. So I want to make 2 points on, you talked about the Mexican middle class, and I mentioned that earlier as well, and that is an important development. In addition to expanding their market, the ability, I think it really does strengthen both sides of the country. But the broader point I would make, and as I've discussed with people in the Mexican government, the issue of migration, it's of growing concern to them, because they are in many ways, they are largely a transit point. But when people are unable to enter the United States, as is the case now, for example, for a number of Cubans who transited through Central America, through Mexico to try to get to the border, they now become a responsibility on the Mexican side to house migrants and others who are coming through the country. So they have a shared interest with us in dealing with the migratory issue, particularly because they are a transit point for tens of thousands of people who are coming through the country, and if they can't ultimately get into the United States, obviously wind up staying in Mexico and becoming a burden to them as well. So I do think there's the opportunity to work in partnership with them on the issue of their southern border and the broader point of migration. And just as an aside, just to note sometimes how these things are more complicated than they appear at first blush, Mexico has 13 free trade agreements encompassing 45 countries. By comparison, the United States has 14 free trade agreements with 20 countries. So what that means is Mexico basically has free trade access to 60% of global GDP in a tariff-free environment. So if you're thinking about making something, and it says, even if 40% of the content is U.S. made, and it says made in Mexico, you have access to 45 countries through free trade, compared to only 20 for the current United States standing. And that's something a lot of people don't realize. One of the things that is, yes, their labor costs are lower, and they actually have very high-skilled labor for the labor cost differential. But one of the advantages they have is that they have free trade with 45 markets comprising 60% of global GDP. That is an incredible advantage that they have built for themselves, quite frankly, and expanding according to what you pointed out. I don't think we've pointed to that enough. But it is one of the drivers that moves people to say, I want the final product to say made in Mexico, because again, I have access to 45 markets, 60% of global GDP. If it says made in the USA, I only have 20 countries that I can send that to, and a significantly less percentage of global GDP. And so when we talk about this free trade stuff and undoing some of it, we're almost, in many ways, cutting off our nose to spite our face in regards with Mexico and that comparative advantage that they've built.